Hello, my name is John Brink, and this is On the Brink from downtown Prince George. It's a beautiful day in Prince George. It's moving towards the spring, and today we have a very special guest. Her name is Pennington.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. And Catherine has an amazing background and very diverse in many areas. So tell us a little bit about where were you born, or where are you from?
So I'm originally from a really small community in north central Saskatchewan called Duck Lake. And when I say small, I mean small. There's 500 people in it. I think there's still 500 people in it today. And you know, I often say, people tell me, oh, I'm from a small community or a small town. And I always think, try me. I might one up you on the small community of 500 people, but that's where I grew up with. It's a small town in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, and it was called Duck Lake?
Duck Lake, Saskatchewan.
Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. And then, so you grew up there, you went to school. Were the schools then close by, or did you have to travel to?
No, it's it's a pretty small place, so
yeah.
You know, pretty small community. School's there. So I went to school in the community of Duck Lake, and then I also went to school outside of Duck Lake in Prince Albert and Regina. So I grew up all over really the province of Saskatchewan, and I moved for university. I went to college in Alberta, and then I eventually finished my undergraduate degree at UVic. So did a bit of movement around Western Canada in my younger years.
So then, as you grew up in Duck Lake, you did your lower classes there, and then from there on in, you went to college in.
I went to college in Red Deer. Actually, there's a bit of the story behind all of this,
okay,
right?
Yeah.
So when I was growing up and going to elementary school.
Yeah.
I was diagnosed with a learning disability probably in and around, I'm going to say probably the early 1980s. And that was really formative for me, because the learning disability, as we all know, has a real impact, right, on what you believe about yourself. I was diagnosed with dyslexia in the early 1980s. I now know that it probably wasn't dyslexia. It was a different kind of learning disability.
What?
Well, I think now it's probably actually more of a math-specific disability. So at the time, there was sort of blanket diagnosis. It was really early in the diagnosis of learning disabilities and really understanding them.
And you say dyslexia, correct me if I'm wrong, that is when you have a difficulty kind of creating the words together and form sentences?
Yeah, that's right. So there's actually a multitude of learning challenges that come with the umbrella term dyslexia. And it's certainly not an area of my expertise, but it's an area that I know a little bit about.
Well, yeah.
And so historically, the thought was that it was more associative to reading and an inversion of words and letters, but it also affects things like pattern, spatial recognition, the ability to do puzzles. There's now actually a lot of research that suggests that children that have ongoing ear infections and different ear-related challenges can exhibit symptoms and signs similar to dyslexia.
So when did you conclude that it was really not dyslexia, but it was something different?
I think as my ongoing education and interest in this area has gone on, I would say, based on the research and learning that I know today, applying that to the situation would probably tell me that it most probably wasn't that, but it certainly was a label that was really challenging as a child, right? So I got this early learning diagnosis, really difficult to learn, really challenging. And in a really small community in the early to mid 1980s, there wasn't much in the way of support. I mean, some of the teachers that I had in the school that I went to had taught my father. So this is it's a small community, not a lot of turnover, lots of wonderful things, but lots of challenges. And so learning was really tough for me. So I did go to school, in outlying areas, in different places. There were a little more support, but it was a real challenge to get through school.
Recognizing the difficulty that you had in the schools in Duck Lake, they send you to other locations that gave a bit more support? or was that circumstantial?
Yeah, I think it was probably more circumstantial.
Okay.
My parents divorced actually quite early.
Okay.
I was probably about 7 years old, and so
And-
my parents divorced,
Yeah.
and my mother and my brother and I moved into the city, and the city. Okay, I have to clarify this.
Yeah,
the city.
more than 500.
I should have clarified, but it's actually the city of Prince Albert, which in many ways is very similar to Prince George. You've probably been there. High degree
Yeah.
of forestry and
Yeah.
participation in the forest sector.
Yeah.
But growing up, there was a little more in terms of services for me,
Yeah.
which was helpful for sure, but certainly not to the same degree that we would see today.
No.
So I love learning. I'm a learning fanatic. I
Yeah.
never stop. I keep going, and anytime I can learn anything, I want to. And it's just sort of baked into my DNA. But I think the reason for that, John, is that the learning was such a challenge for me.
Yeah.
And I think I mean, it was really uncertain if I was going to make it through high school, let alone through college and then
Yeah.
eventually university and then into graduate
Yeah.
school and advanced studies. That was never on the table.
Yeah.
I didn't have any belief that I could do that.
No.
But I
How
think,
did you push through that?
honestly, I think I saw the difference between the outcome of education versus the outcome of non-education. And I'm just sort of back up a little bit.
Did you fear that? Or?
Well, I did fear it. I did fear not advancing in life. I think that's fair to say. But kind of evaluating my environment, I could tell that an education was a necessity in order to be successful.
Yeah.
And so I think that's actually what did it, was just that. And I actually credit having to push through the learning disability and the discomfort that created a lot of personal grit.
Yeah.
So I think as an outcome of that, and probably a lot of challenging family situations, the truth is that I just found a way to kind of build up that resolve and that determination.
To can do.
Yeah, to keep going.
Yeah. And a certain amount of stigma attached as well.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of stigma attached, and I felt really stigmatized. And that when I kind of think about it, that's probably the genesis or the origin of any insecurities that I maybe still have today. Really come from that feeling of not being able to keep up or not being smart enough.
Yeah.
And that vulnerability.
Yeah.
But I also really credit those early experiences with precisely the grit that has allowed me, to do the things that I've had to that are hard, to be successful.
Yeah.
And I actually saw one of your episodes, you were talking to someone about a doctor who has ADHD, and you were, talking back and forth about it. And it's very similar in that I think oftentimes the things that are the most painful and challenging for us are the very things that help elevate us, right?
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't say that I'm thankful for it because it was really hard, but I appreciate the gifts of it.
Yeah, yeah. And I something about my background is that I failed grade 3, and I always say nobody fails grade 3 that I know, and I failed grade 7 3 times. Mm-hmm. So and then the question was that. Should we send them to the mentally challenged school, or do we get him into a job someplace so that he can at least learn to do something with his hands? And so they put me into becoming a furniture maker. And so.
What did you think of that at the time?
It was tough in a way, because I was born during the Second World War. November 1940, and then there was it was a challenging time because my dad had been drafted into the Dutch army, and for 5 years they didn't know if he was dead or alive.
No contact.
No contact, zero, because the last time they saw him was in the bombing of Rotterdam.
Okay.
And I had an older sister, 1 year older than me, and then brother 2 years older, and then my mother, and they had a real struggle on a day-to-day basis
just to survive.
Just to survive. And what I always talk about is that that things that I remember is the hunger And still now I can remember always that feeling of hunger, and the other one of cold, immense cold, always, you know. And then we had this little heater in one little room, and we sat around it in the winter of 44, 45, but extremely cold. And the other one was anxiety, with all the bombers overhead, 350 planes in the air sometimes, you know, day after day, day and night, when they were bombing Germany. And, you know, and then, you know, there was some fierce fighting around us and seeing too much that we shouldn't have seen.
You know, there's a lot of work that has been done in the last 10 years and specifically around trauma and the impacts of trauma on the body.
Yeah.
And I find this so fascinating. And actually, Dr. Gabor Mate, who is practices here in British Columbia, was a doctor in the downtown east side, is Hungarian, was born about the same time as you, similar experience. His parents actually are survivors of the Holocaust. And his work really demonstrates that when we experience trauma in our lives, it stays with us. And his research and his work supports the additional work of another great man, Bessel van der Kolk. And he talks about how the body maintains those memories and those experiences locked inside.
Amazing, isn't it?
So when you're talking about that feeling of cold or that feeling of hunger, it's in your body, it's always there.
Stays there. The other part happened is that my brother was 2 years older than me. And, you know, when I failed grade 7 and they had to find a job for me, and my dad had a friend that had a furniture factory, so they got me a job there. And then over the weekend I had to go and get coveralls. And so we went down to the coverall store and clothing store, and they got coveralls. They didn't even have the sizes that fitted me, so I had to roll them all up here, and then the crotch was hanging around my knees. That's modern now, but not then. and with my brother, unfortunately he passed away 2 years ago, but he used to be about 2 inches shorter or higher, taller than me, but in those pictures he could put his hand out and I could stand underneath his arm. So I'm positive that the effects of the anxiety of all the things that happened around you in the early years affected your body in terms of how you developed as a young person at the same time. And you know, so and then years and years later I found out here in Prince George, actually, I was in a store and I read a book. I don't read many books, and I saw this book, Driven by Distraction.
Oh, yeah.
And I started looking at it.
That's Gabor Mate's work, that I'm talking about, yeah.
ADHD. And I looked at it and I said, that's me. And so I wrote in the book in Dutch. Now finally I know who I am. Yeah.
That must have been like such a feeling.
I was 50, yeah. I couldn't believe it. And then from there on in, obviously, I started looking at on the computer and kind of researching more and looking at the checklist. And out of 20 questions to do a self-analysis, I had 19 of them. And the 20th one was impulsivity. And I have that too, but I trained myself not to, because otherwise I wouldn't survive.
Well, you wouldn't have been as successful. And you know, what's really interesting about ADHD, recent research is showing that there's a deep correlation between people that are what we call conceptual thinkers. So in thinking styles, there's 4 predominant thinking styles, and we really believe that that's baked into your DNA, like you're just sort of born with these styles. But one of them is conceptual. And these tend to be big picture people that connect systems, that when they're talking to someone, they're visualizing, they're thinking about how this relates to this and goes to this and then this, and that's probably you, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. And I think that that's really powerful, because language defines what we think about ourselves and how we orient and behave. Yeah. And so if we can actually take something as a negative disorder, associated negative disorder, like ADHD or dyslexia or, you know, whatever disorder, pick your disorder of choice. You know, I've had an eating disorder. You can pick whatever you want. Right. And if we can actually reorient that to, you just happen to be a deeply conceptual thinker, how are we going to change people's lives and children's lives from how strange are you to how smart are you and to how powerful are you?
Absolutely. Yeah. And only there was always a lot of stigma attached to it. When I was 58, it must be 20 years ago, so that I found that book. And then, more recently, in the last 2, 3, 4 years, I've been speaking about it more in terms of, if I look at myself, I was honored by getting an honorary doctorate from UNBC, and I did a presentation. And, and I usually incorporate it into my presentations. The war years left me with PTSD. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
And then the other part, and that I had counseling for that at one point when things were difficult. It was not for that particular issue, but we, in a relationship from time to time that are difficult, everything worked out fine. But so then we were talking to the counselor, and the counselor said to me, I want to talk to you, and my partner at that time was with me, and saying about some other issues. I said, okay. And he said, I think you have an issue with the inner child. I never even heard of it,
So what was that like for you when you heard that?
Amazing. And then went into counseling, and probably over a 2-month period or so. It's grueling, but it was there. There was no question about that, Yeah.
I'm really actually fascinated by that. So there's a gentleman that I follow. He's a professor and an author and a teacher, and his name is Terry Real, and he's out of the US, and I've taken some of his courses. And one of the things that Terry talks about, and he works with couples literally like on the edge, right?
Yeah.
People that are not going to make it. And he's an amazing couples therapist, and I use some of his techniques in my work.
Yeah.
But he talks about how we have this thing called an adaptive child. It's basically a child in grown-up clothing.
Yeah.
And so when we're growing up, we see models around us of what an adult is.
Yeah.
And then we emulate that. But the truth is that most of the adults around us are broken people, and especially during crisis, wartime, etc.
Yeah.
The worst of human behavior is shown.
Yeah.
And so as a child, we tend to think that those are our models, or they are our models.
Yeah.
And then when we get into relationship, predominantly in romantic or marriage or long-term relationships, that's where the child emerges. Yeah. And we really need that wise adult to step forward and say, I got it from here. Yeah. You take that 8-year-old, that 10-year-old, that whatever child, whenever you were wounded, whenever it was really a tough time for you, and you step in front of them as an adult. And you say, I'll make you a deal. You stay here, because when you open your mouth, the devil comes out. Bad things come out. Yeah. But I'm going to be the adult here, and I'm going to step forward. And it's amazing how when we think about that, but we're all the same person that we were when we were born, when we were 2, when we were 22, and 42, and 72. Yeah. So it's an adaptive process. So I'm glad you found that. Were you able to use that going on in life?
Oh, it's no question about that. And thinking in terms of, it was emotionally and very grueling and very intense, the counseling. But then kind of looking back at it, in a lot of ways, where did it come from is substantially from being alone with a parent, because the dad was gone, and fighting on a daily basis for survival, of the fear, and then seeing far too many dead bodies or wounded, and the fear of losing that only parent that was there, and and that, those kind of things.
Well, 2 things really happened there, John, and you probably would have explored this in counseling, but linking it to the work that I do, when I hear that, there's 2 things that are happening. One is that as a child, you're actually becoming what's called parentified, which means that as a child, you kind of step into the caregiver role, because you have an undue responsibility in that moment to be a caregiver and a care provider for your mother, to be an emotional caregiver, support maybe to other family members. And that's what we call parentification. And there's times when that's necessary for a family to survive. There's no other choice. So I had an experience where my mother was single for many years. I was older by 5 years, so I was really required to step in and care for my brother and act as a small mother to him.
Right.
But that came at a cost to me, because the expectation, just as it would have been for you, was, you know, to be an adult very quickly, and you wouldn't have had a childhood just given all that occurred.
Exactly.
So that's the parentification. But the other part you're talking about is just survival. So what happens to humans is, when you are in a situation that requires a survival,
right,
there's a part of the brain, it's the oldest part of the brain. It lives at the brain stem. It's about the size of your thumb, probably half the size, and it's called the amygdala.
Right.
And that small gland, and again, I'm not a neuroscientist and I'm not a medical doctor, but that small part of the brain is the oldest part of the brain, and we share it with reptiles. It's called the reptilian brain.
Right.
And around the brain, around that is the other more complex and adaptive structures where we do all our thinking in the neurocortex. Right. We do all our feeling in the limbic system.
Right.
But when we're under stress or strain, the amygdala activates, and that reptilian brain is not designed for thinking, and it's not designed for feeling, and it's certainly not designed for complex discussions or decision making. And what the amygdala does is it pumps out hormones, so cortisol, epinephrine, adrenaline, primarily cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And you need that to survive. So if you need to jump in front of a vehicle or pull someone off of you or run really fast, you want that amygdala to be working really, really well.
Right.
But what happens in times of acute stress, so wartime, if someone's been raped, or continued, or there's an event or an experience, that amygdala gets activated and doesn't shut off. So it's constantly pumping a survival scale hormone into the bloodstream.
Right.
And so then you get a severely activated system. Now, this also occurs in people with acute stress. So people that are constantly working, constantly on, maybe feel a sense of wired but really tired.
Right.
That's also a sign that it leads to burnout.
Right.
But when the amygdala is activated, and we call it sometimes a hijack, because something happens and you're just instantly mad or you're instantly activated. What's occurring in that particular context is that's switching on, and it's having difficulty switching off. So for you, growing up in that environment, always on, acutely aware, looking around, like even to this day, I bet that you can read a room, you can read people, you can read the environment, you know what's going on around you in the back of your head all the time. Yeah. Because if you didn't have that, you wouldn't have made it. So what happens to build this out is the amygdala is activated. It's an acutely activated survival system. That's where you hear the term fight, flight, freeze. That's what the amygdala does. It's a total survival skill. Right. And interestingly, like I've worked with women who've been raped or attacked as an example. Right. And one of the hardest things for them is often, I didn't fight back. Well, they didn't fight back because the brain made a determination, you're not going to survive if you try to fight back. You need to play dead, because that's a survival. If you look in the wild kingdom, animals fight, animals run, or animals play dead. Yeah. And we do exactly the same thing. But when we live in environments of hypervigilance, then we have this sort of constant thing that happens.
It's built into our system.
It's built into us. It's hardwired. So just to build this out a little bit more, when we live in environments, well, we all live in environments, but when we're growing up in certain experiences in life. So for you, I can use this as an example because you've been so open about it. So when you live in that environment and constantly things are happening around you, you have a heightened sense of awareness, survival skills are activated, you learn coping mechanisms or survival skills just to get by, just to make it. Now, in your case, it's very clear. You're trying to live every day, and you're actually visually seeing death around you. Talk about a heightened survival sense. When you're then out of that environment, the survival skills that you learned during that time don't just go away. They're not just over. So you take those survival skills with you, but like anything, it now doesn't fit the environment that they were designed for. So it becomes dangerous to us. It's what's called an overdone strength. So if your survival skill is hypervigilance, constantly looking around, feeling nervous all the time, anxious, not feeling like you really trust anyone because you grew up in wartime where everything is, there's an undercurrent, and you get into a personal relationship and it's really hard to have trust with someone. Yeah. Or you feel constantly on edge. Yeah. Or when you hear a plane take off, you think about the 300 planes overhead. Yeah. Then that survival skill no longer serves you.
Yeah.
It doesn't do you any favors.
No.
It starts to eat at you.
Is there an other side to that side as well? But I sometimes feel, I agree with all the things that you say, that you can develop that survival part in, I don't know exactly how you called it, but that it gets trained to that it makes you more. But I find a lot of times, because it seems that I'm a fairly high energy individual all the time, and all kinds of things happen every day is a big day. I always look forward to the day. I get up at 5:30 and I'm in I get up and I'm ready to go, and there are all kinds of challenges I enjoy every day, but they are full of challenges. And I like that and I enjoy that. And I think that has been part of my life for my whole life, like that.
Well, what you're talking about is actually something we call post-traumatic growth. So you hear about post-traumatic stress syndrome. We now classify it as disorder, but post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder. But there's post-traumatic growth, which says that for many, many people, after a very stressful time in their life, complications, near-death experience, or really terrible upbringings or experiences, that if you are able to harness the survival skills and through resilience, channel whatever's inside of you, that drive, that you can actually grow from really traumatic experiences into something called post-traumatic growth.
Right.
And I think that's actually beautiful, because we all have hardships, right? Every single human. We're talking about a very extreme example, and you would, share that with a generation of people, but many of us have not lived through that. But we have lived through alcoholic parents, we have lived through poverty, or we have lived through violence or personal violence, or even now, the last 2 years, the pandemic. Like, I think about my kids. Up until 2 years ago, notwithstanding wartime, we had no social construct for what we were living through.
No.
So we all live through hardship. And the goal of being a human isn't to avoid hardship, because then you'd be dead. The goal is really to live through it and to grow from it. To take what you can from that experience and channel it back in, and then to do hopefully something good with it, right? And that's what you've done. So then you feel this sense of eros for life. That probably really comes from being surrounded with the reality that can be over in a second.
Interesting. And so to me, it's something that's very, very interesting. And then kind of looking back at ADHD, which has become part of my life. And so a year ago, 2 years ago now, I wrote a book, right? Where's my book?
I read some of it on the internet.
And so we wrote another book that is coming out in July the 8th, actually, and it's about ADHD.
Oh.
Yes, and so this is the one, Against All Odds, which is an autobiography, and it took me 80 years to live it, 20 years to think about it, and 2 years to write it.
Love it.
And the challenge with this was that you can't write a second one and saying, okay, forget about that one. I wrote another one now.
It's like having children.
There's only one, So, and, so then I kind of felt that I had to write about ADHD. And the way I look at it is, it's a superpower to me. If you can unlock ADHD, and it gives me the ability to do things that other people cannot do, as well, is that I can be in a situation where I have 20 different issues that I'm working on. I focus on one, and it gives me the energy to work on a lot of stuff all at the same time.
It's turned out to be like your competitive advantage, perhaps.
Yes. And the other thing that I found is that the frequency of occurrence since I started it and became more public about it is, I found out from a lot of people and say, no, I don't really talk about it, but that's I have that too. Or I know somebody in my family that has that, and I know other people that are struggling with it. So So I wanted to write a book about it. A book not from a medical perspective. There are plenty of those, but more from somebody that has lived with it, partially knowing, and from 58 forward, really when I was 58, when I saw the book and I started reading it and basically saying, well, that's me, of applying it to my life and then really turning it into an advantage.
I think that's a fantastic thing to do for a couple of reasons. The first is that when we tell our story and it influences others, it's so powerful, because when you can talk about your experience and the fact that you've been very successful and well known and done lots of amazing things, then anyone who might be struggling today or feeling like it's a sentence can actually see a reframe on the story, right? Story is so powerful. It's how we communicate, it's how we connect. And so to be able to use that as that opportunity, that platform, I think means a lot. I also think that in the modern context, labels and diagnosis is very common. And I have two opinions on this. Like, on one hand, I think the value of getting a label or a diagnosis is really important, because then as a medical health, or I guess a mental health practitioner, an allied health practitioner, I can really tailor the way that I support people. So if someone comes to me and says, I have bipolar 2 disorder, which is incredibly common. If I'm suffering with depression, anxiety, and eating disorder, ADHD, any number of things, I then can really tailor what services would be best for this person, or I can pick from a modality that I've learned and then apply it. And I kind of know where to go with someone. On the other hand, what scares me about the frequency of diagnosis is we typically as humans live up to our labels.
Yeah.
And I did that.
Yeah.
So when I was a child diagnosed with dyslexia, learning disability, the story that I applied to myself was, I'm stupid. And I lived to that stupidity label to a T. I actually learned helplessness. That's the term for it, which is I didn't think that I could do something, so I didn't try, I didn't show up, I didn't fight for it. And then more than that, I believed that I couldn't, and so I felt helpless, and I lived up to it. Yeah. And it really wasn't, I suppose I got through high school. I know I got through high school, and kind of looked through like the college syllabus of like, what does not have math? What does not have science? What does not have labs? And I was like, education, okay, check. Like, it was early childhood education at the time. I think it's called something different now. And then from there, I then went into university, into social work or human and social development. And I love the field, and I've never looked back. It's a beautiful field to work with. Working with people is my greatest honor. Yeah. But it actually, the genesis of it really started from this sense of being, this label. So I'm very cautious with labels. I think they're great. They can inspire. And we also need to be mindful of how we then internalize that. And it becomes a limiting belief, right? When we have a label, that limiting belief can be really impactful.
Yeah. You see, I had the same, that even from the time that I was a kid, when I failed grade 3, that was not very good. And when I failed grade 7, then it was troubling. I turned more inward. But I was always a happy-go-lucky individual. And even then, and then, when I worked in a furniture factory, and then in the evening went to school, that was all my alley, because now I could work with my hands, and and then I was drafted into the Air Force for 2 years when I was 18, and was part of Air Force security and special forces. Actually, I don't know why, because I was still relatively small for my age. I had a brown belt in judo. Maybe that's why they thought I should be in that part. I wanted to be a pilot, and but even then, still, that Holland very structured in terms of you have to have diplomas for all the things that you do, and you're measured by what they call your education, and they then refer to that as formal. And and I thought that would be a problem to me. And then when I came out of the Air Force, my dad managed a small lumber company, and that was part of a much larger group. And I was hired by the larger group, and I ended up in that auditing department and became fairly stepped up in the ranks already when I was 24 years old, 23 years old. I was already an assistant manager of a plant, and that should not really happen. So a lot of people said, well, it's because of his dad, right? So, but I was still struggling with the failure of that.
Oh yeah.
And I, because of the liberation by the Canadians, my dream was always to go to Canada, the land of my heroes. And then the other part was, because I grew up in lumber, I dreamed about building my own lumber mill. And then the other part was very important, is that I wanted to kind of, in a way, not punish myself, but I felt that I failed and I had to start anew. So I left Amsterdam. I didn't tell my parents about that. I had applied to emigrate. I went to the Canadian Embassy and then Hague. I said, I want to go to Canada as a landed immigrant. They allowed me to go. I didn't want any sponsors. Somehow they were okay with that, and within 3 weeks I would be leaving. And so I told my parents about it a week before I would go, and that was traumatic to a certain extent, but I had to do this. So I left with one suitcase, $150, and couldn't speak the language, didn't know a soul, didn't have a job. Then came to Montreal, the train to Vancouver. That fortunately I ran into a German guy that in Vancouver, and I told him what I wanted to do. I could speak some German, and I wanted to build a lumber mill, and he said, Prince George, 1965, that's where you have to go. So, and when I arrived in Prince George in July of 1965, I had counted my money. I had $25.47, and no job, and didn't know a soul, couldn't speak the language. But then I started to, and I knew that I would go back either successful or in a box. And and then it started my journey of starting as a cleaner man, then a lumber pilot, and on and on and on. But very quickly, within a year and a half, after I came here, I was superintendent of a lumber mill, one of the largest ones here. And then within 2 years, I was part shareholder in a lumber mill in Watson Lake, Yukon, Watson Lake Lumber. And I owned a motel within 2 years.
When I hear that, it's so interesting, because this sometimes that deep-seated feeling of failure is the thing that really motivates a person.
Yeah.
And so it can be a negative in that it becomes a story or a narrative. And that's my specialty, is what's called narrative therapy. So it's, what are the stories that we tell ourselves, or how we construct our orientation around the world.
Yeah.
And then we live up to those stories. That's why language is so important to me. But for you, that feeling of like, underneath it all, maybe that shame of failing grade 7.
Yeah.
You said 3 times.
Yeah.
Right? Failing grade 3. Coming from the experiences that you did, that there's turning that failure into drive.
Yeah.
Right? And there's this fine line between turning something into drive and then giving over and believing that you can't.
Exactly.
One of the things that can happen with really successful people is they can have a ton of success and accumulate, many good things, but it can always live within them, that fear of scarcity, that worry that things could go back.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can really drive us, but it can also be challenging too. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does to a certain extent. So what kind of unlocked it is the reading against all odds, against driven by distraction, that I knew now that it was ADHD.
You better get Gabor Mate on your podcast. You would love to talk to him.
Yeah. So, and and so from there on in, already by the time I had that, I already had the lumber mill here, but I still had issues that I was dealing with. And the other thing that was very important to me, and you are very special in that field in particular. I was not a good communicator, very self-conscious and all of those things. And then what happened is a couple of times I got in situations where, because of the mill that I had and all the other things that I had to communicate to a number of people, and that didn't go well. And I would freeze up, and then my sister-in-law dragged me to Toastmasters. And I was part of Toastmasters for 10 years, rose to the highest level in Toastmasters, became a distinguished Toastmaster. And since the time I've done a lot of public speaking, and I'm very, very active. But, so that was another critical point of gaining the self-confidence. And then obviously on the business side, we've been very successful. And the other part I find it so interesting about it, that although I'm much more public about it now in terms of my lack of formal education, is that I talk about it more now, and I always say nobody in the 57 years that I've been in Canada ever asked me, "Okay, John, where are your diplomas?" Nobody did ever.
Well, education is so many things, and yet in the culture that we live in, we tend to privilege and prioritize something we call formal education. But I'm Indigenous, I'm Métis, I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of British Columbia. I'm originally born of the Métis Nation in Saskatchewan, and many of the people that I grew up with, including my grandmother, who just passed away on Monday at 93 years old.
Oh, sorry to hear.
Yeah, thank you. She was a beautiful lady. Did not have a formal education. She actually went to residential school.
Yeah.
But her knowledge and her way of knowing and her wisdom was profound.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important that while I have pursued a lot of academics because I thought I couldn't, and then I figured out I could, and then I just wanted more.
Yeah.
The truth is that the knowledge that all of us have in the experiences that we have, that lived experience, really needs to be as elevated and privileged. And so if anybody is out there that thinks, I don't have this and I don't have that, that's bullshit, because quite frankly, you have lived experience in your area, and that's what really counts.
Exactly.
But in the culture that we're in, I love this work by Johan Hari. I should send you it, you would love it too. He's a researcher and a communicator, and he talks about how in the culture that we have junk food, and then we have junk values.
Yeah.
And those junk values are the things that tell us we're not enough, we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we need to consume more, we drink, we eat, we numb with certain behaviors, we're addicted to social media.
Yeah.
Like all of these things are the junk values. And I think one of them is the privilege and the classism around education. And let's face it, if you live in this country and you have had access to education, even if you've had to work hard for it and get a student loan and everything else, that's still privilege.
Yeah.
There's people not one block from here that have never had that opportunity.
Exactly.
But they have wisdom and they have skills.
Yeah.
And we would be right to be better servicing those people.
Exactly.
And including them in decision making.
Yeah.
I chair the Prince George Community Foundation.
Yes.
I'm the first female Indigenous chair of the organization. It's now 27 years old. And we're doing a lot of work and thinking broadly about how do we include all voices in the foundation and the work that we do.
Yeah.
Philanthropy is no different than the corporate sector, than in banking and et cetera, in that it's been predominantly white Western voices that have been at the table with power.
Yeah.
And so shifting the power to be more inclusive of people of multiple backgrounds, of lived experience.
Yes.
Is really what we need to be focused on. And so we're doing a lot of that work. And when you mentioned education, it really made me think about the value of that.
Yeah. And I feel the same as you do in terms of, and I always say, the formal education doesn't mean lack of education. Is that what I see now is more people are becoming much more sensitive to different learning styles that people have that are equally as effective in whatever they want to do in the future. If I look at, and I have no particular hang-ups about my education or the lack thereof in the formal setting, but to communicate that to others is important, I believe, and saying what can we do to, to have more people feeling, first and foremost, having confidence that they're okay. And who they are, what they are. What you were saying is that the indigenous community, Metis, and for me being a foreigner in a sense, I believe that having respect for anybody and everybody, I find unique in Canada, more so than some of the parts that I came from. When I grew up, it was a lot of times by, my parents' parents were farm laborers, and they were not always looked at as, the same.
Yeah,
and to be respectful
that's right.
of all those others around us is very, very important, I believe.
I think this is a great nation. I'm always incredibly thankful to be a Canadian. It's a privilege and it's an honor. And we have some work to do in Canada. We're not as inclusive as we ought to be. We have a legacy that we're only now beginning to talk openly about, within the Indigenous, how it is that Indigenous peoples have been treated in this country. Just yesterday, 2 more locations in Saskatchewan were identified and recovering. I use the word recovering because it's not finding. Our elders always knew that that was the case.
Yeah.
But this country has a lot of work to do. We are not as inclusive of immigrants, of first and second generation Canadians.
Yeah.
We privilege and prioritize predominantly white voices still today.
Yeah.
We have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be mindful of that and to think about the ways that we can be part of the Canada that serves all and not the Canada that was, or that is somehow, this fictitious Mecca. I think that we need to take our glasses off and look at what's really happening.
I agree with that. We had the privilege of being part of the Indigenous Day.
I saw that
with
my friend Ivan.
With Ivan and Wes, and I got worked with them on the drumming, and
I saw that.
and then we did we had the orange shirts, and it was kind of comical. So we, I forget now what date it was, either Canada Day or the other one. But in any event, we got a whole lot of shirts, and maybe well over 100, and so we took them down to the park, and so we had a lady taking him down for the park for us. We were going to hand them out off the stage, and we had already announced it. And then the lady the young lady, not her fault, that started to unload them out of her truck. By the time she had unloaded, all the shirts were gone. And everybody was wearing them. No, I think to create the awareness of don't look in that direction, but saying, let's recognize it and recognize it for what it is, And
I think that, we are uniquely positioned here in this community. So the Prince George Foundation, Community Foundation, did a vital signs study. It's a national study. It's from the Community Foundation of Canada. We sort of format based off of their guidance. And we've done 2, one in 2017 and one in 2019. And in both instances of that research, what we found here was our Indigenous population was greater than 12% in our city. And that's really of the sample size. So it's probably much higher. But we also have, in the diversity of this community, other populations, right, that we need to engage with and connect with and learn, and the richness from, and all of that diversity makes us a richer more aware, more inclusive culture that's better for everyone.
Yeah.
So I really am sensitive to the importance and all the actions that I can take as an individual and the organizations that I serve. I'm also a director, vice chair with the YMCA of Northern BC, and we're in the process of an amalgamation as part of a provincial movement. And we're so focused through the Y movement as well as the Community Foundation on how do we better position for the future of our organizations that reflect everyone and providing services to everyone. And that's a framework that I bring into the work that I do with people every day. I think we all need to feel a sense of belonging. We all need to feel a sense of connection. And when we do, we're better. But then we're better parents, and we're better spouses, and we're better community members, and we give better. We're more connected. And these are the things that make it better.
There's only upside.
There's only an upside.
With the Y, you're quite involved in it, as you know, we are quite involved in the Y as well. I always find it an amazing organization that is really not funded by anybody other than by donations.
That's right, 100% philanthropic.
And does a lot more than what appears to be, the gym and all the other things far beyond that are very supportive of families. And
it's actually like the YMCA collectively is the largest social service provider in the province of British Columbia. So if you look at all the Ys that come together, they provide amazing social services. It's critical infrastructure in the province of BC. And as you mentioned, it is all provided through philanthropic efforts. The Y movement supports children and families. It connects programs. And we've got the Foundry just over here across the street. It's kind of like, and if my friend Selin was here, I'd give him a poke, Selin Alpay, but it's kind of like Canadian Tire. There was a time when they used to do their advertisements and they'd say, we're more than tires. It's kind of the Y. The Y is so much more than swim and gym. But, it still gets branded that way. But it does really, really important critical infrastructure, social service development right here and actually all over northern BC and then, of course, across the province.
We can do 2 sessions. We may have to do more than this.
I tell you.
Yeah. So before we end this one, tell me a little bit more about you and your family. You travel pretty much all over. I know you've been very, very active in many, many areas. And but to give me a brief overview, you did amazing accomplishments in terms of your studies and in how you went about it. But you have amazing credentials and you do many, many things in terms of counseling and all of those things.
Well, the most important thing about me is I'm a mother, and I have 2 children. I have a almost 15-year-old, and 15 and 12, girl and boy.
Yeah.
So a daughter who's almost 15 and a son who's 12.
Yeah.
So that's the most important thing about me.
Yeah.
And I'm married, and I own and operate Momentum Coaching and Counseling Services. And I started that practice officially in 2018, but I've been working with people in a therapeutic way for over 20 years.
Yeah.
And I started the business because I was providing a lot of services, and it just seemed like the natural thing to do to kind of, structure it. And then when the pandemic hit, I sort of knew intuitively that there was going to be a serious demand for mental health services.
Yeah.
So I leaned in heavily into the service delivery of counseling, both for individuals and couples. And I would say right now about 80% of the work that I do is in counseling, about 20% is coaching. They're very different fields and they're regulated differently. So I am licensed and registered. I'm here in the province of BC through a college that oversees my practice as a therapist. And I really love the work because it's an honor to work with people and share space and time and story and to really understand and provide information and learn more about people and for them to learn about themselves. I don't offer advice. No. My job is to be a guide. You know, I guide, the person decides where they want to go. Yeah. And I think that that's really powerful. Counseling's also been a part in my life really important. You know, I struggled through a lot of early challenges, like we all do, struggled through an eating disorder, struggled through my own mental health challenges. So it was really formative. And after I completed social work, then I was really interested in specializing. Yeah. So that is mostly about, the work that I do. And, we've lived here in this community now I think going on 12 years.
Yeah.
And it's a great place to raise a family. You know, I love the outdoors.
Yeah.
I really do.
It's amazing.
You know, I love cross-country skiing, and I love being at the lake in the summer. So I also think that this is a really warm-hearted place. My clientele is actually really all across the country.
Yeah.
I also really love the north. So I've done a lot of work in Nunavut in the north. Well, not a lot, but I've traveled in Nunavut. I've done a lot of work in the Northwest Territories. And I've always been fascinated with my time, you know, working in those regions.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a really special part of the world with this incredible organic and natural wisdom that just comes through. And I've had some of my most blessed experiences in the north. But the clients that I work with are really all across the country. And I do have a great opportunity to travel across this country. But fast fact, I've done almost zero traveling, like real traveling. I've been almost everywhere in Canada. But really, I've been to Scotland. I've been to England. I've been down to the US, a few states, but that's it. Because
you've not been in Holland?
No, I haven't been home because you know what? When I was growing up, I was busy looking after my my family needed me at that time, and then life just goes on. So maybe one day I'll get to go to nice places. But my husband said, "Where do you want to go in the world? Like, where do you really want to go?"
Yeah.
And I said, where I really there's a library in Norway that's made of wood and it's supposed to look like a whale.
Yeah.
And he said, like, of all the places, you want to go to a cold place to a library? Like, we could do that here. Do I have to spend all the money to go to Norway? But maybe one day.
Yeah.
Let's do a podcast there.
I like it,
Or in Holland.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed our discussion.
Likewise.
And like to have you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.